All right, I'm going to go ahead and drop our participant guide. I'm going to have to drop it a couple of times because I'm sure more people will join us as we move forward. Now, where did you go? Okay, it just dropped. Oh, it's loading now, so you guys should see that shortly. All right, looks like it's loaded. Perfect. So you can kind of pull that down, do what you do with it. Before we kind of hop into our content for this week, I wanted us to kind of reflect on what we were able to accomplish from our field work from last time. So one of the things that we were looking at doing was soliciting feedback and potentially providing feedback. You had the option to look at it in a couple of different ways. And so I'm curious, and I got field work from a couple of you. I'm curious to hear how that process went in terms of soliciting feedback, particularly when it felt like more of a risky conversation. How did that go? Is this where people say, well, my dog ate my homework? Anyone have an opportunity to solicit feedback or to give feedback where you need to give feedback? No? All right, so then what we're going to do today is we're going to go through last session all over again today. And then we'll do this session another time. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. So part of the reason why we ask for you guys to kind of engage in the field work is because when we think about true development, it goes beyond just the session, the time that we have together. But true development is what you do with the information you learn in a session. So the power of our time together really happens once you leave the session. And so that's the purpose of the field work, so that you can start to get this in your bones and start to implement it in your practice. What we don't want to see happen is that you're investing your time and money in these sessions, but then you don't have an opportunity to really hardwire it into your practice. And so you leave the Institute not, kind of in the same place you were in because you didn't have an opportunity to kind of practice the skills. So we just really encourage you to do so. The other thing that we want to, oh, I uploaded the slides. Oh, shoot. I didn't mean to do that. Hold on. Thank you, Rick. I'm going to delete this one. And
this is why you always have a wingman.
Yep, I appreciate it. Thank you, sir. The other thing that we want to talk about is your final project. And so one of the things that you're going to be doing, because we're kind of halfway in, is identifying a business solution that you want to solve for. And all the skills that you're learning in the Institute will equip you to do that. So it's almost like a capstone kind of a thing that you'll deliver to the group at the end of our time together. And as part of that process, you have an opportunity to be partnered with myself or Rick to be your coaches as you work through those business solutions. So you'll have up to 2 sessions with us to help you kind of pull together this final project. And the project, don't necessarily think of it as a homework assignment for Leadership Institute, but it's really a way to identify something that you really want to tackle at work, whether it's a new project, whether it's implementing a new change, whatever that business needed, building a new marketing plan, whatever it is that you have for your business. We want this to be value added for you. And so we can help you along the way with that. So we'll be sending out additional information on what that process looks like to you guys over the next week. Do you have anything to add to that, Rick?
No, just this is a great advantage, just to reinforce what Tish just said, as far as, that we've all heard the expression knowledge is power. It's a well-known expression. It also happens to be only half true. The only power that you get from knowledge is when you apply it. And so applied knowledge is the true power. And so the ability to integrate the things that you've learned, and we're almost through the first two, we're halfway through the relationship piece. We've already been through the leading yourself piece. So you've got enough now to be able to say, okay, how can I start to apply some of these basic things on communication, time management, goal planning, attitude? What sort of goal can I create that will set me up for greater success between now and the end of the Leadership Institute there in December? And it doesn't have to be a goal that is accomplished by December, although that would be ideal, but certainly one that is well underway by December, so that you can present back to the group and on progress and how you applied the ideas that you learned through the year-long program. So it really, we can't stress enough that all of this is great stuff, but it has limitations as if it's never applied. So it's the application that we're really focusing on. And you have the opportunity to, if you've never been coached, to be coached through this process. So once you create that goal, then, as Tish said, you'll get further information. But those that are actively going to participate will have the opportunity to be coached by either Tish or myself.
Awesome. Well, any questions about that? More information to come, but we wanted to kind of tee that up since we have a captive audience. Nope. All right, cool. So today we're talking about this concept of managing conflict, and it's probably one of the biggest challenges as I work with leaders that they have is managing conflict, whether it's conflict within themselves, conflict within peers, with their boss, with their direct reports. It's a tough thing. And sometimes we shy away from it. And so during this time, we're really going to invite you to lean into it, to get closer to it as you address conflict. And so I'm going to level set for you, kind of just provide some foundational information related to conflict. Then we're going to transition into a framework that would really help you navigate conflict and difficult conversations in a much easier way. Will it ever become easy? No. But can we give you tools to make it an easier process? Yes, and that's what we're hoping to do today. So spending some time on level setting, the most of our time will be providing you with the tools you need to be able to facilitate and navigate conflict much easier. So I'm going to drop, because we have a few more people who have joined, and I'm put. All right, the participant guide, for those of you who have just joined us, I just dropped it again so that you can pull that down. All right, I'm not able to see you, but yell at me if you can see my slides.
Looks good.
Yes.
Okay, you good? Okay, perfect. So this is kind of where we are related to our Leadership Institute approach. We always want to share with you kind of where you are on the journey, and Rick alluded to it just a moment ago. And we're in that space of really building relationships, because as you know, in order for us to be successful in what we do, it's a three-pronged approach. How, the self-awareness piece of it, which is what we spent the first half of our sessions doing. How do we begin to build effective relationships, and how do we run the business? And so we're creating an experience that kind of is very holistic in terms of you being successful, either as a business owner, as a leader, or as an individual contributor. So this is our roadmap for today. We're going to look at the different types of conflict. We're going to look at ways to reframe our thinking around conflict. And we're going to also learn some steps on how we can navigate conflict easier. So here's how we're defining it. Here's one definition that is offered to us. Competitive or opposing action of incompatibles, antagonistic state or action as of divergent ideas, interests, or persons. So that's one definition from Webster that we have. Another that they offer is mental struggle resulting from incompatible or opposing needs, drives, wishes, or external or internal demands. And I think when we think about conflict, I think all of us can kind of visualize this idea of tension. And again, whether it be conflict or tension within or with other people, there's this sense of tension or this idea of being stuck. And so what we want to do is start to break that tension so that we can get the result that we want, because we're in conflict because we want to achieve something, and what we want to achieve, we're in opposition of something else. And so what we want to do is break that opposition so that we can achieve what it is that we want to achieve. That's the idea, is to get to an end result. It's not to win a battle, but it's to get to an end result. And I think when we think of conflict, we often think of it as a win-lose situation. And if we go into conflict thinking, I need to win this, then in that moment, you just lost it, because it's all about achieving a result. Here are the different types of conflict, and we'll go into detail about each of these in a moment. And this is in your participant guide too, so you can jot down notes on the side of your, in that section. So task, relationship, and value. So task conflict are typically issues that people have with their work assignment. How is work being divided up? How are resources being shared? Who's following policy? Who's not following policy? And typically we see this as a peer-to-peer issue. With task conflict, I think we all can say that we've been in situations where we see people looking on the other side of the fence. Well, they come in late every time, so I'm gonna come in late every time. Conflict. They have more, I have more on my plate than they have on their plate. Conflict. It seems like you get the easier projects and I get the harder projects. Conflict. And so when you see those kinds of things in the workplace, it naturally creates this peer-to-peer conflict. And so it's about really looking at task conflict as a way to think about innovation. So if we can break our mental models around task conflict being you have and I have not, if we can break that mental model, then we can transition into the result that we want to achieve. So for example, if we have a challenge with the type of work that's assigned, if we have a challenge with policies and procedures, instead of fighting against each other on it, it's about sitting down together and being innovative and thinking about creative ways to address it. But again, instead of working together, we dig in or give in, and that's not the result that we want when we're trying to address conflict, particularly with tasks. The other is relationship conflict. So this is a struggle, disagreement, or argument between two or more people. Typically, this happens when there is a personality conflict. You see this a lot in personality conflicts. And then with that, it impacts the level of trust that we have. We're going to talk a little bit more about how to address relationship challenges, because this is the one that is the hardest to address, and it's the one that we never want to address because of what it means long term. So we'll dig into that a little bit more. And the final one is values. And Rick talked about this in the first session we had around our values. And this is another place where people have entrenched thought processes, mindset around their belief system, and it can be related to politics, religions, ethics. So that's one of those things that, like, when you go on an interview, they say, don't talk about politics, religion, or any of those kinds of things, because people are it's what they feel is fact versus really just positioning it as it's my belief. What people typically do when we're looking at a values conflict is it's people are trying to compel others to see things from their own perspective. And I'm sure many of us have been privy to people that look at us sideways because we don't hold the same belief system. And it creates a lose-lose outcome situation. Instead, what we really encourage each other to do, particularly when it comes to values, the thing that's really deep for us is to think, I want to seek to understand this person. I may not necessarily agree with the position they hold related to politics, religion, ethics, and what have you, but I'm going to sit down and listen. I'm going to seek to understand what their perspective is, but I may not necessarily agree. So those are the three types of conflict we see: task, relationship, and values. So I'm going to stop there and interested in hearing your thoughts. I'm going to drop the participant guide one more time because I'm sure other people have joined us. Talk to me. What are your thoughts on those three different types of conflict?
I think it's interesting. I can see how it falls into like these three different categories. And I can already see some like examples where I've had like to face certain ones. So I think it kind of breaks it down nicely.
Because when we think about conflict, we think about it in this kind of this big picture instead of kind of thinking about it in these categories. Because when you think about it in the smaller categories, the three different categories, the approach that you take to address each one is going to look a little bit different. So the approach that you're going to take to address a task conflict might look a little bit different than how you address a relationship conflict or a task conflict. I'm sorry, or a values conflict. With task, it's less personal than relationship and value. It's not stepping on our personal toes, if you will. And so that's an easier conversation to have when you start to talk about, we're conflicting because our personalities are very different. But what happens when it's not about us being different, but it's about us recognizing that we have a goal that we have to accomplish and we have to look beyond that? Thoughts? Damaris, I saw you put take your mute off. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, I was thinking more of maybe value conflict, because I was thinking about my brother, and you said that people believe that their opinion and their belief is fact. And a lot of people, when people don't agree on something, because in someone's mind, like my brother, he believes what he thinks is true in fact, and you have to believe what he believes or it's wrong. And I was laughing at that because oftentimes if you come over to my house and because he always wants to talk about these things, but he'll get upset if I don't believe what he believes or see things how he see it.
Yeah. And then that makes you frustrated, right? It's like,
I just stop talking. Yeah. I'm like, oh my.
Yeah. And then when you see kind of values conflict, it also has the potential to impact the relationship. Because if there's always this kind of push and pull, it could really impact how you engage with it. It doesn't mean that you don't necessarily like the person anymore. It just kind of like what you said is like, I just stopped talking. I just don't say anything. So it impacts the relationship. And when we think about, particularly in the workplace, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And when we get to a point where we kind of shut down, then we've created barriers that does not help us achieve the goal that we want to achieve. And so how do we begin to engage with people that our personalities are different, our values are different? I may not like the person, but I do have to respect him if I want to achieve the results that I want to achieve. Susie, were you going to say something? Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Damaris.
No, I was just saying that's very interesting because in the workplace, I guess everybody comes with something. And, you know, we all think differently. We all do things differently. And we have to think about, because task is easy, like you said. If we have to get something done, then that might be something easier to achieve because, you know, we know that we have a common goal. But then when you're not thinking about tasks, then it gets more complex because then what do? How do you move forward? How do you take those steps? You know?
Yeah, exactly. Susie?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Catherine.
No, I think, was Susie gonna go?
I don't
that's
think so. No, she's okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was kind of thinking about when they all start to interact and show up and how, they can kind of influence each other depending on what's going on. And so just really thinking about the need to repair and how sometimes that might be difficult depending on how far into these conflict zones we might be, and especially if they're all going on at once.
Yes.
So that's
Yeah.
kind of where my head went with it.
And you make a great point that they start to, because I mentioned that how values conflict can impact the relationship, but it can also, all three can be at play, and it just becomes this kind of just conglomerate of mess. And how do you start to kind of tease that out? And so prayerfully, with what we talk about today, you'll get some tools and resources on how to tease all of that out, so that's not as scary. Because if you try to look at it like this big, huge ball, you're like, yeah, no, I just am not going to deal with it. I just rather ignore it, because the headache that it's going to give me is not worth it. And so we avoid it. But remember, at the beginning, I mentioned that the goal is we're trying to achieve something. So it's not in our best interest for us or the other person if we avoid it, because they're the key to us helping to achieve a result. When we create workarounds, then we're adding time, we're adding frustration, the quality of it may not be as great. And so we want to be very thoughtful about how we think about conflict. So go back to our slide. So there's this idea around constructive conflict. A lot of times, like I said before, I've really had to change my mental model around how I see conflict, because a lot of times when we hear the word, we think of it as negative. But there's beauty in having conflict. What it does is it really creates environments of trust, because if we can sit down together and say, okay, I trust you enough that I can sit down and tell you my truth, and I feel safe enough to do so. That's where we want to arrive, is being able to sit down knee to knee, eye to eye with someone and say, I have a really tough conversation I need to have with you, but I trust you enough that I can have that conversation in a way that it can be constructive, and we walk out with a better understanding. So here's some of the kind of tenets, if you will, of constructive conflict versus destructive conflict. And this is brought to us by a distant job, constructive conflict. And they talk about it in a remote setting, but it also works where we're in person as well. So participants talk openly and respectfully. We're going to talk about this concept later called pool of shared meaning, that really invites both individuals to talk openly and respectfully with one another. And it also invites us to appreciate the diversity of opinion. When you think about all of these things related to conflict, a lot of it is it's introspective. So in order for me to have an appreciation for diversity of opinion, that starts with me. So a lot of times when we want to have constructive conflict, there's some inner work that we each have to do. And we can't be so connected to or married to our perspective that we leave no room for any other perspective, because we're not perfect. Having meetings where we're collaborative. I'm sure many of us have been a part of meetings where we are directed. You will do this, you will do this, and you will do that. And we have feelings about it. We have feelings about the approach because we have an experience, but we don't feel safe enough to talk about it. And so what we want to create is an environment around us. We want to create an experience that people have with us that we are very collaborative. And that kind of alludes to the next one around brainstorming sessions and having some really good open dialogue. Is it possible to have brainstorming sessions when it relates to conflict in our personal lives? Absolutely. So you have a young adult who's saying, you know what, I have been in school most of my life and I'm tired of it. I'm dropping out of college and this is my final year. As parents, we will blow a gasket because, and in that moment we have a conflict. But if we think about how can I make this conversation constructive, the approach that we want to take is let's talk about this versus the approach that we would naturally take is you're going to do what I tell you to do and you're going back to school. But that's not going to get us a long-term benefit. So being able to sit down and say, okay, I hear what you're saying. Let's dig into this a little bit deeper. Tell me more. And start to kind of peel back that onion and be willing to kind of negotiate some things. And then being able to have kind of productive teamwork. And on the other side, you have the destructive conflict. Team members point fingers at each other. We've seen it. Some team incompatibility. One of the things that's important as teams are coming together is to spend some time getting to know each other. A lot of times when you have a lot of transition in teams, you kind of just are thrown together and you're off to business. But the one thing that we encourage you to do in order to be able to create an environment that you can build trust and have constructive conflict is to get to know each other. And you can do that in a myriad of different ways. The way that I like to do it is through validated and reliable assessments, because it helps people to get a sense of themselves, and it also gives people an opportunity to get to know their team and what their role is on the team and what gifts they bring to the team. So as you're bringing groups together, if you're a new member, even if you're an individual contributor, or if you're a leader, think about ways to make sure that you're spending time getting to know one another. And it could be through assessments or different, I try not to use the word team building because I like to think of things having a greater purpose than that. And so think of ways to do that. Unfocused team members, and that is where it's important for us, whether it's you who might be unfocused or other team members being unfocused, is the gift of feedback. So our last session, we talked about providing feedback. And so this is an important piece of it, is that sitting down with people and saying, hey, this is the expectation that we have, and we're not seeing that. Let's talk through what's happening here. Lack of self-control and unproductive meetings are the other tenets of destructive conflict. So what's the anatomy of constructive conflict? We focus on addressing the issue, not attacking the person. Focus on the issues, not attacking the person. And that lends itself to cooperation. When we think of, I want to go after the issue, not after the person, it puts us in a mental capacity to be able to be cooperative. And we want to have a commitment to resolve the conflict. So we don't want to act like the elephant's not sitting in the room, like panting at us when there's conflict. So we don't want to act like it's not there. We have to recognize that we're in an impasse. And it's important that, we have a goal we want to accomplish. How do we get there? Respect for others, and of course, open communication and honesty. And I think sometimes we kid ourselves around what that honesty piece looks like. And I if I could have a personal transparent moment, the whole honesty piece, I think to myself often, I don't ever want anyone to experience me as dishonest. And so what can I do in my day-to-day life to make sure that whomever I'm interacting with can trust what I say and can trust what I do? And I think that's a really important emotional intelligence piece, is to be able to really look at how am I showing up for people? Because other people may be having conflict with us, and it may be because of how we show up. They put up a wall because of how we show up. And so having those kind of self-reflections to say, am I showing up in the best way possible? Have I ever given anyone a reason to distrust what I'm saying? So having that kind of personal awareness, which kind of lends itself to that last bullet point, which is promotes self-awareness. And people who are affected by conflict, encouraging them to speak up. Now, being mindful of the fact that it's one thing to be able to say, oh, we have conflict as a team. I'm encouraging all of us to speak up. If we haven't created a culture that's safe to do that, then it's not going to happen. So before we say, I want everyone to feel comfortable speaking up, we've got to clean house and say, well, do I have the type of culture that invites people to want to speak up and feel safe doing so? So with that being said, what are some ways that, you know, we may say, I want you to speak up, but then it's not safe to do so? What does that look like? Yeah, speak up in a meeting. What would make people say, yeah, no, I'm not sharing it? Go ahead, Susie.
That your idea or your solution is not validated. You know, it's like, no, that's not a good solution. You know, well, that won't work. Or
Yep.
you've tried in the past and you were shut down each time.
Yeah, that the shutdown part, that kills you, right? It's like, you want us to speak up, but the last 4 times I spoke up, I got I got chopped off at the knees. And so I'm not going to do it again. I'm not going to take that risk. What are some other ways that we shut people down, even though we say, oh, it's safe to speak up? What are some other ways that tell people that it's really not safe?
Maybe by the way that, like past experiences of how someone's responded to us, that maybe we didn't feel like they hurt us or that it was really helpful. Like we walked away with maybe what, you know, we were looking for. That might be a bit of us managing our expectations, but just, you know, that past history hasn't shown us that that's maybe like a safe space or something that can be really talked about with that person.
So how do we create that safety? So we say, we don't want to say, yeah, it's safe to speak up, but we really don't have the kind of environment or culture that allows us to do that. So when we think about ourselves personally, what are some ways that we can demonstrate that it is okay to speak up?
I think having like a moment of like honesty and vulnerability, showing like exposing yourself so that others feel comfortable exposing themselves too. So they're not just like, oh, I have to go first and then I look weak and like our team or something. Like I look flawed, where like if you expose some of your flaws, then other people are more welcome to like say like, oh yeah, well, I also have flaws, like, because obviously not everyone's perfect.
Yep, perfect. Thank you, Yesenia. What other some other ways that we can create? Yep, Susie, go ahead.
Keeping the conversation, you know, like with the whole group and not, you know, and not, you know, like bring it up in as you're passing somebody else's desk saying, why would Susie even say that? You know, where it, you know, you're out of the big meeting and you're having a conversation with someone else that the person who came up with the idea finds out that your idea wasn't validated at all. They thought it was way off in left field.
Yep. Yep.
I think, Tish, too, that I think when you give people credit for what they've suggested and continue to validate what they say, if they come up with an idea or it brings anything, pardon me, that works or that got everybody thinking, I think continually acknowledging when people contribute and it's been really valuable or really brought something to attention, I think is minimal thing you can do that I think really matters when you're trying to get people to engage, when they know what they're contributing will be from them. You know what I mean?
Yep. Perfect. Yep. I saw a hand. Now her camera is off, I think. Can't remember. I didn't see who that was.
It was Lucy.
Lucy. Okay. Lucy, did you have a thought? No. Okay.
Yes,
Oh,
I'm
there
sorry.
she is. Okay, go ahead.
I'm here at work and got called real quick. So my idea was basically what Peggy just mentioned too. It was like to grab one of the ideas that is given, let's say at a meeting or something, start implementing it, and then update everybody on of how that idea is actually working for the team. So that was it.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Lucy.
Thanks.
What happens in our, let's take it to our personal lives, because that's just as important as resolving conflict in our professional lives. How do we begin to give people a different experience with us when we have always butted heads with a particular person? So let's say it is a cousin that you've constantly butted heads with. What can you do to begin to rebuild that dynamic between the two of you that makes it safe for you and them to engage in a more constructive conversation and relationship? How do you rebuild?
I think that it comes from what we're talking about, where you got to have some self-awareness first. And I'm just coming off of a 4-day wake and funeral of my mom. So I'm inundated with family issues the past month or past week. But I think it's knowing yourself, like, is this a relationship breakdown? Is this a values, like Damaris was saying with her brother? Like, where I think all of these conflicts intersect. Like, for instance, with this wake, like there were tasks that were a problem. There were, some value things that were a problem. I think that they always intersect, but kind of figuring out where the glass ball between task, relationship, and values is. Is this more of a value issue with my brother, my cousin, my sister? Or is this more like a personality? I don't like how she speaks. Or is it a task? Somebody's getting burdened too much with too many things and maybe taking off some things. I think it's just kind of having that self-awareness as the core of where does it fall within those 3 things that you discussed, Tish.
And owning it, right? The quickest way to change someone else's behavior is to first change our own. And I think when we're in conflict, we look outward and we say, they're the issue, they're the issue, they're the issue, they're the issue. We can't change them. We can't force someone to be different. But what we can do is take stock within ourselves and say, well, what can I do differently that may inspire that person to show up for me differently? So conflict and resolving it really starts from a personal place where we want to be able to be different, and then hopefully that'll change for the other person, and they'll want to reciprocate the change that you're making. The other thoughts, questions?
Tish, if I may, Tish, if I could also connect this to the session we had in March around diversity, equity, and inclusion, because isn't what you're talking about really just inclusion? Equity and inclusion, and managing the tension that may come from wanting to do that, whether you agree or disagree. So I think it's just I think it's a great opportunity to tie what we've already talked about to the present conversation, just to show how connected all of this really is. So, just think about you're really just talking about inclusiveness and psychological safety, which is part of the intimacy piece of building trust.
Yeah, good point. Thank you, Rick. And it's beautiful to see how all these sessions kind of build off of each other, because as Rick was talking about that, what came to mind is your DISC, and what are your style and your preferences, and how does that influence the how you communicate with people and how you interact with people, because that's another piece, how you resolve conflict. So awesome. Let me hop back.
I was thinking too, piggybacking off what Rick said, I was just thinking about the equity piece and values in the last year or so, and how exhausting as a country it's been. And sometimes the best way to engage is to just disengage, with so many people on public platforms spewing their values, that sometimes with relatives or friends, it's just easier just to sit back and disengage, because it was exhausting. I think the global pandemic might have been God's way of us not having Thanksgiving discussions and tables because there was just so much conflict. And so that kind of been resonating with me throughout this conversation.
Yeah.
And there's a dynamic in the world of conflict, around specifically around avoidance. It's called an avoidance spiral.
Mhm.
And the more you avoid, you think that you're making the situation better by staying away from it, when in fact the opposite is true.
Mhm.
The more you avoid, the bigger the spiral and the deeper the pit becomes, until final conflict was to begin with.
Yeah, I just disengage and not definitely go back on a Facebook post and add what I was really thinking.
Yeah. Cool.
Social media as a whole, we could spend 3 hours just on that.
Yeah, definitely. All right. So thanks for that conversation. I just really want us to start to think, because when we think people, you hear people talk about conflict in so many different ways, but how do we really make it real and applicable to our lives in a way that it's workable, and we can bring about some changes in terms of how we look at it and how we address it. All right. So I want us to, now that we've kind of level set and kind of have an idea around the 3 levels of conflict, what the anatomy of constructive conflict looks like, how do we then start to pull it all together? So some of the things that we want to think about is changing the semantics, changing how we think about conflict, and how we think about the person that we're having conflict with. So rather than considering the other person an opponent, thinking about them as holding the key to offering a new perspective. And the other piece of this is focusing on the what before we focus on the how. Because we hop in and we say, okay, this is how we need to address this issue. But neither of us have gotten clear on what it is that we're trying to address. So we want to focus on the what versus the how. Second thing is watch your butts. We want to avoid appearing overly negative when we're talking about a situation or come across as inflexible. So we want to avoid negating your intent by using the word but. So for example, it's, I don't want you to think I don't respect you, but you just completely negated what you just tried to say. So we want to just be mindful of how we use the word but when we're engaging with people, because it can bring about a whole different level of conflict. Relying on data more versus our emotions, because when we're in conflict, the thing that seems to want to show up most prevalent is emotions. And because it shows up so strongly, we latch onto that. And we go with that versus taking a step back and saying, what information do I actually have that's real? What is the data related to this situation? And then what that does is it helps you to address the right issue. Because if we go on our emotions, we're not going to achieve the goal that we want. We're just letting our emotions take us wherever our emotions takes us. And so we want to make sure that we are focusing on the right issue. And the way to do that is to look at data. Things that actually happened, behavior that actually happened, reports that you can kind of see different behavior or different performance indicators and things of that nature. So rely on the data, not our emotions. 4, we talked a lot about this, about promoting self-awareness, really having an out-of-body experience to explore how we might be contributing to the issue, and then really focusing on ways to get beyond that. Avoid generalizations like you always, or that will never, or everybody always. Like that is the quickest thing to shut people down in the conversation, is when we use general terms like always, never, it'll never change, those kinds of things. The person is like, well, then what's the point of us having this conversation if you think that this is how I always am, and it puts up a wall. So avoid generalizations. And finally, seek understanding, not a final agreement. First, focus on focus on what first versus the why, and discuss what you are solving for, then explore the actions that you need in order to take it. Sometimes we go into a conflict and we want to try to seek some level of final agreement when we haven't really understood the essence of what it is that we're talking about. So first seek to understand what is at the heart of this issue. Why are we so upset about this issue? Why is this particular issue drawing a wedge between us? Once we can figure out what's at the core of the conflict, then we can work towards then what do we need to do to get to a different place. So seek understanding first versus a final agreement up. Any thoughts, questions on those kind of 6 tips? No. All right, so what are the 3 kinds of conflict?
Task, relationship, and value.
What with task relationship, what is that focus, task conflict, what is that focused around?
A particular task, a particular issue.
Yeah, and what specifically?
The problem and not the people. Oh, I'm sorry.
Who was that spoke up?
Like more work related, like she was saying, like a specific task, more like peer conflict, work getting divided up.
Yep, perfect. How about relationship? What's the essence of a relationship conflict? What's at the core of that?
Personality.
Yeah, some personality conflicts. And how about values? What is values conflict focused on?
What people believe.
Yeah, yep, their beliefs. And a myriad of different things, right? It could be a number of different things related to that. Okay, cool. So those 3 levels of conflict is going to we're going to use those ideas as we kind of transition into our next section, which is giving you the tools to start to address this conflict. So let us take, I have 9:59. So let us take a 11-minute break and let's come back at 10 o'clock Central Time. I think everyone is in this time zone, but let's all come back in 11 minutes. So 10 o'clock on the dot, we'll hop into our next section. Cool. All right. Welcome back, everyone. So before we transition into this next section, are there any questions I can answer, any thoughts you want to share before we hop into arming you with tools? Nope. Okay, cool. So when I was thinking about this topic around managing conflict, you know, what we want to know more is how do we address it? And so there's a framework that I absolutely love that really helps us to build our confidence and ability to address it. And it comes from Crucial Conversations. And so there's some modules that I think that will be very beneficial. Their training is typically 2 days, but you're going to get enough to make you dangerous in 2 hours. So let us hop right on in. All right, are you guys seeing Get Unstuck? Is that what it says? I can't see you, so you have to yell out to me.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So in addressing conflict or addressing, you know, difficult conversations, there are several pieces to consider. So there's this whole concept around getting unstuck. So what is it should I be addressing? What kind of conflict should I be addressing? And so that's what this first section is about, is what am I addressing? What do I need to talk about? But before we do that, I want to share with you this whole concept of silence and violence in a conflict. So on one side of the continuum, as you can see, there's this idea around violence. And on the other side, it's silence. So in a conflict, on the silence side, what do you think is happening? In a conflict, if someone's gone to silence, what's happening?
They're disengaged.
Mm-hmm. Yep. What else? What else are you seeing?
They're upset and they just don't want to share.
Don't want to share, so they're quiet. What's happening with body language with someone who's gone silent?
Defensive, arms crossed.
Mm-hmm.
Lack
Yep.
of eye contact.
Yep, lack of eye contact, arms crossed, they're kind of leaning back. So that's one side of the continuum, silence. There's another side of the continuum where someone may go violent in a conflict. And when you see someone going violent, and I don't mean physical violence, but when you see someone who is being violent in a conflict, what are you seeing?
The
They're
child
kind of
is
yelling,
Yelling, so we might
taking
see
it personal.
Yep, seeing some yelling. They may take it personal. What else are we seeing?
I'm getting very defensive.
So defensive. Are we listening at all? If we've gone to violence?
No.
Oh, no.
No. And the body language is probably, you know, with silence, we saw kind of a withdrawal, right? But with violence, what we see is the kind of the moving forward, the compelling. All of us have a tendency, if we can be real honest with ourselves, all of us have a tendency to either silence or violence in a tough situation, whether it's a tough conversation or a conflict. We go to silence or violence. I tend to be on the silent side of things. And I'm sure some of you may tend to be on the violent side, but when we look at each side of the continuum, one side or the other isn't going to get us the result that we want. If our tendency is to shut down, that's not going to get us the result. If our tendency is to go violent and not listen to the other perspective and compelling others to our own, we're not going to get a result. But look at what's in the center of this continuum. There is this beautiful sweet spot called dialogue. In a conflict, that's where we want to sit. We want to sit in this space of dialogue, divorce ourselves from going silent and violent, and really rest into this sweet spot called dialogue, because in dialogue, what's happening?
Communication.
Yeah, we're talking to each other. We're trying, we don't understand where you're coming from, but we're really trying to seek to understand. I'm inviting you to share your thoughts. I'm sharing my thoughts. We want to be in a space of dialogue, but the challenge is our emotions drive us to silence or violence. So the goal is to recreate a different story in our head about the conflict so that we want to be in dialogue with this other person. So here's the problem. When we're stuck or not achieving what we want in a variety of areas, ranging from awkward to failing relationships, dysfunctional teams, cost, quality, safety problems at work, what we want to do is learn how to identify the crucial conversations, the conflicts that are the key to organizational, team, and interpersonal success. So when you look at that, a lot of that is along the lines of those three conflicts that we talked about earlier in our session. So here's the full motto. And I like to point this out because there's a piece of this that's so important, and I alluded to it before. And it's this, so there's stuff that you do before conflict or conversation, stuff that you do during it, and stuff that you do after. So the stuff that you do before, take a look at what this says. Work on me first. Work on me first. So before we deal with the conflict, we got to first take an introspective look at our role in this thing. And so the components that we're going to talk about today are getting unstuck. A little bit, we'll start with heart and mastering our stories, and then we're going to talk about path of action and how do we start to have that conversation with someone. But I want to call attention to this sacred space that's in the middle. And it's this idea called the pool of shared meaning. And some of you who may have been in sessions with me before may have heard this part before. We talked a lot about how do we create environments, how do we create cultures that inspire people to want to speak up and give their perspective. This is an illustration of what that looks like. So if you take a look at this motto, we have my meaning coming to the pool of shared meaning, and we have their meaning coming to the pool of shared meaning. So before I even give you a definition of what pool of shared meaning is, how would you define it just based on looking at this schematic?
Like a safe place to kind of disclose and put your thoughts out there.
So a safe place to disclose and put your thoughts. Great. What else? Any other thoughts on pool of shared meaning? Okay, cool. So I'm going to give you an example. So in Chicago, we have been having some nice hot days. So let's say it's the first week you can take the kids to the pool. So they're all excited. You're all excited because you get to get out of the house for a little bit. You get to the pool, and as you're approaching the pool, you see that it's a different color than blue. It's not looking too nice. And as you get even closer to inspect it, you notice that the smell is off. You know, it doesn't smell like that chlorine, and there's just debris and stuff floating in it. So when you approach a pool and you see all of these things happening, it doesn't look right, it doesn't smell right, it just, nothing is right about it. Would you get in that pool? Yes or no?
No.
You would probably go in a completely different direction. You would not get in that pool. It's the same thing when we're trying to resolve conflict with someone. What are we doing to the pool of shared meaning? I think it was Yesenia or Lucy who said that the pool of shared meaning is a place where we can each share our perspective and it's a safe place. But what we do sometimes, particularly if we're driven off of our emotion, we pollute the pool of shared meaning. When we pollute the pool of shared meaning, the other person does not feel safe to share their perspective in any way, shape, or form. How do we pollute the shared meaning? When we're in conflict, what are some ways that we pollute the shared meaning? How do we do that? How do we pollute it?
Would it be kind of like the one conflict, like trying to push your perspective on someone or making yours like, oh, my way or my view is the right way? Like
Perfect.
how?
Yep, that's one way that we pollute it. What are some other ways we pollute the pool of shared meaning to the point that people are like, I am not getting into this conflict or conversation with you?
Not listening.
Not listening. What else? Keep them coming.
Making that person feel judged.
Yes, so judging. What else?
Just the past history of your communication with them and not hearing them, not listening, and valuing or acknowledging their thoughts and feelings.
Right. Perfect. And in our mind, we're justified in how we are showing up in the conversation. We're justified in how we might be polluting this pool of shared meaning. But if we want to get to a result, if we want to resolve this conflict, what we have to be open to is making sure that the space that we create between me and this other person is pristine. That when they come to this conflict with you, or they come to this conversation, they come to this discussion with you, they don't feel judged. They don't feel like you're going to knock down their ideas. They don't feel like you're not listening, but they feel like, yes, this is a tough conversation, but I'm feeling safe enough that I can have this conversation. So when you are in conflict and you have to approach it, be mindful of what you're doing to the pool of shared meaning, and being mindful to not pollute it with our body language, our facial expressions. All of those nonverbals are also things that pollute the shared meaning. So make sure that space that you're inviting someone into is a safe that they want to be in. So here's a definition that is provided for us for that. It's the facts, experience, opinions, and feelings held by participants in a conversation that are understood and appreciated. It doesn't say agree. It just says understood and appreciated. We won't need to go here. This is typically what causes conflict or a need to then step up to it, and we call it a conversation when we need to step up to it. Is three things are at play. There's opposing opinions, so we're not agreeing on something, conflict. Then we mix that with strong emotions about the conflict, and the stakes are high. These are kind of the three elements that tell us, okay, we're in conflict and we probably need to have a conversation about it and not avoid it. So anytime you find yourself stuck, there's a conflict or a conversation you're either not holding or you're not holding it well. So what that means is, how many of you have had situations where with a particular person, you've had this conflict over and over and over again, and it doesn't seem to be fixable, or you're always here and you're not understanding why? I've had those situations where it's like, gosh, why is this not changing? Why is it not being fixed? It may be because I'm not having the right conversation. So remember, we talked earlier about the three kinds of conflict: task, relationship, and values. Those three things look and sound a bit different. And so I might be having a relationship conflict, but I'm trying to have it talking about it like it's a task issue. And so it's important that we know the kind of conversation that we want to have. So there's a couple of different things that you do to identify what conflict do I really need to talk about. So identify where you're stuck. What do I need to talk about? And then you unbundle it with this concept called CPR. Talk about that in a second. So what I want you to do on your participant guide where it says get unstuck, there is a section that says get unstuck. What I want you to do is just take a minute And I want you to think about a conflict or a difficult conversation you need to have with someone. And I want you to jot down a couple on the professional side and a couple on the personal side. And we're going to be referring back to this periodically throughout our time together. So I want you to take this time now to identify a conflict that you're faced with, a difficult conversation you have to have. It could be personal or professional. Just jot down a couple of different things. And they have some questions up here to consider. So I'll give you guys about a couple minutes to jot down a couple of things on those two sides, personal and professional. What questions can I answer as you kind of get to that? Okay, cool. I'll let you get to that.
I have a question
Yeah.
separate from this.
Yes.
When you were talking about looking back and seeing like, oh, maybe you're looking at the conflict as a different lens. What if you view it as one lens and someone else views it as a different kind of conflict, but you don't view it as that? So what if someone's taking it personal, but it's a task for you and you don't see it as something like that? Like what happens when you guys view conflict differently? Like,
yeah, that's an excellent question, because that's a reality, right? Because that's conflict. Like I see it one way, you see it another way. And so it's about sitting down and having a conversation. First, recognizing that I recognize that how you see this and how I see this is very different. So I want to clarify what I'm seeing it as, and really understand your perspective about why you see it the way you're seeing it. And so it's first starting there to say, I see that we see it differently. Where is the difference of opinion? And as we go throughout our time today, you're going to get some tools in order to help you facilitate that kind of conversation when you might have different perspectives. But again, it starts with seeking to understand before we're trying to fix the problem. You first got to figure out, well, what is the problem before you try to fix it?
thank you.
Mm-hmm. Personal and professional. About 1 more minute. All right, how many of you had something, at least one in either column? Had one in professional, one in personal? At least one in each. Yes? Or had multiple ones? Had multiple, okay. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to pick the one that's on either side of the list that gives you the most angst. I want you to pick the one that when you walk in from a hard day's work and you put down your bags and you let out this great big sigh, everybody in your household knows exactly who you're going to talk about. I want you to pick the one that when you wake up in the morning and you're getting dressed and you think about having to interact with this person, you automatically get stomach aches. I want you to pick the one where when it's time for you to go to a family outing, you get there 2 hours before because you don't want to interact with that ignorant cousin who always acts a fool at the family reunion. So I want you to pick the hardest one on your list. Put a heart by it, a star by it, a dot, a check mark. Pick the hardest one on your list. You guys got it? Pick the hard one. You're like, don't make me do it. Yeah, I want you to pick the hard one. Because by the time we leave today, you're going to have some tips and techniques on how to address that particular issue. Because again, it's about us getting results, and we want to get closer to the issue so that we can resolve that thing so that we're not constantly losing sleep over it or ignoring it. We want to get to a point where we no longer have to ignore it, but we get closer to it. All right, so now that we have that, I want to, you did the first thing, which is figure out what conflict you want to address. That is the very first step, is figuring out the conflict you need to address. The second thing that you want to do is you want to think about this whole idea of what level of conversation do I need to have? When you find yourself having to have the conversation over and over and over again, 9 times out of 10, it's because we're having it at the wrong level. So we have this concept called CPR to help us with this idea. So the first one is C, content. Content is if something happens one time. Those are easy. Pattern is if the situation has happened over and over and over again. So you're starting to see a pattern of behavior over time. The last one is relationship. And this is a deeper issue because this is where now the issue is starting to impact how you work together, how you see them, how you think they see you. So it's a deeper thing. I'll give you an example. Content. Someone comes to work late today. Hey, I noticed you were late today. Is everything okay? Pattern. Hey, I noticed you've been late to work every day for the last 2 weeks. I'm beginning to wonder that, that there might be some kind of challenge we need to address. Can we talk about it? Relationship. We talked about you coming in to work late, and we've made some agreements, and it's still continuing. I'm beginning to think that you don't value the time of myself or my colleagues. Can we talk about it? All three sound very different. Content is easier because it's just one time. Hey, late, everything okay? Patterns, I'm noticing this pattern, is everything okay? Hey, now I'm noticing that this pattern is starting to impact our relationship. So the relationship issue is a deeper issue. Sometimes we give ourselves a false reassurance and we say, you know what? I think I'm just going to talk about this person being late today, even though what you're really feeling horrible about is that you don't think this person respects you as a colleague. And if I don't think this person respects me as a colleague, that certainly isn't a content conversation. That's a relationship conversation. So we want to be real honest with ourselves about the level of conversation that we're having. Content, pattern, or relationship. So talk to me. What's content?
Like a one-time
instance. One time, it happened one time. Those are easy. What's pattern?
Repeats over and over.
Yep. So it's an issue that we're seeing happening over and over and over. And what's relationship?
The problem that affects the working relationship?
Yes, yes, absolutely. So here's how I like to think about it. Content and pattern is the thing. So remember, I used the example of coming to work late. So content and pattern is the thing. Relationship is the impact of the thing. That's how I like to think about it, is that relationship is the impact. Like, so if content and pattern isn't addressed, it's really going to impact our relationship. So it's the impact of the thing. So when I'm at the relationship level, I'm talking less about the coming to work late, and I'm talking more about our relationship and how we work together, our perception of the relationship. That's what I'm going to talk about. Any thoughts, questions, epiphanies on that?
Tish, I just appreciate that breakdown because I think it makes it clear. When I was looking at the one I starred as what I struggle with the most, I can look at when it happened with the content. Then I saw the recurring patterns because that original content was upsetting. And now the relationship is like, I will avoid you all at all costs because I have all of this history. So that is like perfect in my head to see where you need to not go silent when you see it's starting to slip into that lane, because it becomes very difficult to repair.
Yep, definitely. And it happens just like that, Peggy. It starts off small, but when we don't address it, it turns into a deeper, bigger issue, which then becomes harder to address. So we want to start to address conflicts before they get too big, because the relationship and the impact in the relationship, that's harder to recover from. Can you recover from it? Absolutely. It's just harder, and we want to address things before it gets to that point. And so Peggy actually just transitioned us into the next thing that I want you to do. That item that you starred, check marked, put a heart by, I want you to determine, when you have that discussion, is it going to be at the content level? Is it going to be at the pattern level? Or is it going to be at the relationship? What level has that conflict kind of risen to, if you will? Content, pattern, or relationship? And you can check the box on your participant guide.
I have a question. So
Yes.
is there a way you can address all three?
That is a great question. So the fact that you say that it's all three tells me that it's probably at the relationship level.
Right.
But remember when I was kind of going through the example of coming to work late, content sound like this, pattern this, and relationship that. The challenge of trying to address it all together is the person's not going to have a clue what it is you're really trying to say. Because all of that sounds different, right? And so you have to be clear about, is this a one-time thing? Is this a reoccurring behavior? Or is this really impacting our relationship? Because each of those conversations are going to sound a little bit different. Now with relationship though, there are times where you will use examples from the pattern that got you to this point. So you'll use pattern examples when you're having a relationship conversation, but it's still a relationship conversation because it's, we've had this conversation before 3 times and we made some agreements and things still haven't changed. I'm beginning to think that there's a lack of respect for our relationship with one another, and it concerns me. Can we talk about it? So even though I use the pattern as an example, my focus of the conversation is to talk about the state of our relationship. That's a great question. Any other questions?
Tish, I just wanted to add one thing. Sorry. I had learned recently, people like the word micromanage, everybody hates that word. And I had a leader tell me, if somebody feels micromanaged, I'm thinking about it, it's semantics, it's content. She was saying, if somebody feels micromanaged or you need to micromanage, that's because something is not happening. Being micromanaged is not bad. It means there's a content issue that needs to be repaired. So it's almost kind of paying attention to, when am I being micromanaged? It must mean something I'm doing is not falling in line with what leadership needs. Mm-hmm. So I just had that was hard because no one likes to feel micromanaged. No one wants to micromanage. But when you have that content issue, that's where it starts. Mm-hmm. So I think when we are being micromanaged or something like that occurs, we need to have that self-awareness, like, what am I not following through on? What's not occurring? Because we don't want it to bleed into the relationship problem, right?
That's right. And that's another excellent point, Peggy, because we're going to talk about this whole idea around mastering our stories. because just what you said, like if someone's micromanaging us, that's personal, right? That's like, you like, you don't think I can do a good job, that you have to watch over my shoulder. We take that very personally. And we tell ourselves an infinite number of stories about why. And they're usually not great stories. And the stories we tell ourselves then influences how we see this person and how we interact with them. So it's really important for us when we see a situation, micromanaging happening, that we don't make assumptions about why, but we're curious about why. And we'll talk more about that whole piece when we talk about mastering our stories. So I want us to try on this idea around, is it a content issue, a pattern issue, or relationship issue? So I'm going to throw you into breakout rooms. There are 2 cases that you guys have on your participant guide. I don't care which one you do. If you want to do both, if you got time to do both, but you can pick in your group if you want to do the first one or the second one. But what you're going to do is in your breakout room, you're going to read the case, and then you're going to determine, should this issue be addressed at the content level, the pattern level, or the relationship level? What level should I address this conflict? So I'm going to throw you in rooms. I'm going to give you guys about 8 minutes in your rooms. We got 20, so 5 rooms maybe. All right, here we go. Any questions before I send you out? All right.
Is it me, or did a couple of folks not?
Yeah, I'm looking, looks like, okay, Corey and Kyrie and Camille, they must, okay, Kyrie just went. So Corey and, okay, Camille just hopped in, so now Corey is just still in here. May have stepped away from the desk.
Yeah, that's true. I forget you have to consciously click to jump in.
Some of them will send you directly, and you don't have to click on join. I guess it depends on, I don't know what it depends on, but yeah. How are you doing, Mr. Rick?
I'm doing well, thanks. Doing well.
Good. Okay.
I love this topic. I love, I can't tell you how many times I've recommended Crucial Conversations, and before they discontinued it, Crucial Confrontations.
Yeah. Now it's Crucial Accountability.
Right.
Yeah. So same content, they just changed the name of it.
Well, there's so much crossover, that I use a kind of a cliche-ish, communications is the cause and the cure of conflict. So, it's right there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just find, like, as I was preparing for this, I'm like, oh, building content. I'm like, Crucial Conversations, like in that framework, just works brilliantly with
absolutely
identifying conflict. So like, why reinvent the wheel, Tish?
When the tires are sitting on the shelf.
Yeah, it's like right there. Like, why would you redo it? It's like right there.
Right.
So
yeah, I'm glad you brought up the project, because now that we're getting into the summer, and before we before we turn it over to Holly and Gina for the next 2 sessions, just getting them queued up, to be thinking about that.
Yeah. So I was thinking that you and I can kind of just pull out what we talked about before related to the capstone, and then just forward that out to folks.
Yeah, just put
over the
some,
next
maybe put
week.
some more meat on it and
Yep.
and do it. Yep.
Yep. Cool.
Yeah, and then we can, I don't know that it really matters one way or the other, because I think in this case, we're, unlike the assessments, I think it's going to be hit or miss as to who's going to participate. So we kind of let the, as they commit, in other words, they send us a goal or whatever, something along those lines, then we can queue them up with and assign a coach at that point.
I like that idea. Because another way, because when we were thinking about it before, we were thinking about 30 some odd people, but not all of those individuals will participate.
Right.
So, yeah. And I think it is certainly a pull and not a push. So they'll pull from us. If this is something that they really want, an issue they really need some support in, they'll take advantage of it. But I don't imagine it's something that we would necessarily require for people to do.
Sure. Yeah, the coaching, I think, should be the draw, right? Just to, aside from just whatever their self-motivation is, the opportunity to be coached, I think, would be a bit of a draw. Yeah, I learned that a long time ago. It's I've done that after speaking engagements. Send me a goal of how you want to improve in this particular area, and I'll throw in a free hour of coaching. I've actually landed clients doing that.
Yeah.
But it's a self filtering process.
Yep.
It's so
definitely
cool. All right.
Yeah, well, they got about 3 more minutes.
Okay. Yes, it's been a good refresh. I love the pool of shared meaning, and there's just so, when I looked at this statistically, 75% avoid, about 10% escalate. So, you got 75% doing the silence, you got about 10% doing the violence, and only about 15%
are in the middle.
are in the dialogue middle. It's like, wow.
Yeah. It's scary, right? And the thing about it is, I think sometimes we think, certainly have people that shy away from and run away from conflict at all costs, and they will identify that. But I think in some cases people think, I could do a fairly good job of addressing it. But then I think the key to that is, do you do a fairly good job of seeing what role you're playing in it? And that's the part that I think people are challenged with, is really looking at what's your part. Until we figure out what part we play in it, we won't be as effective at resolving the conflict, because the other person's waiting for you to acknowledge your stuff.
Right.
Like are you even gonna acknowledge that you backstabbed me 4 times before?
Right. I want the score sheet to even up.
Yeah.
Well, that's where, I think it was Yesenia that brought it up. Well, what if the other person won't play? I think that's where the communication styles that came out of the DISC assessment can help with that, right? If you're, you've seen the results, you got a lot of high S's there, which are conflict avoiders almost by nature. So, because they're people pleasers, by nature. So, but then, confronted with a D, or in conflict with a D or a high D, you're going to get a much different conversation, or a high I and a high C in conflict, or the worst of all situations, a high D and a low D, right? Because that's where the DISC can reveal on a team profile. Anybody that's high working with somebody who's really low in that same dimension,
Mm-hmm.
That's where the conflict
Because it's
flags.
truly polar. Like it's
Right, because both have to come out of their comfort zone in order to meet in the
get to
middle
dialogue.
somewhere.
Yeah.
Exactly, to get to dialogue. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating, and I love how all of these sessions start to. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I couldn't resist that opportunity to bring that inclusion, because we're, I'm finding more and more, people seem to be confused by this concept of inclusion, like it's somehow a separate thing over there, but it's not. It's just all part of the human dynamic, and it's, you start to see, conflict, you start to see trust, you start to see just communications in general. It's all part of the inclusion, it's all part of being inclusive. Psychological safety, I'm doing more research on that to bring it into my workshops. Inclusion is where you start psychological safety. It's like, that's interesting. Right? So it's taking it to a whole nother game,
right,
or level of the game. Yeah. So yeah, this is to the extent that we can continue to tie all these sessions together, the better.
Yeah, I would agree. All right, I'm bringing them back. That's contagious, Yesenia.
I'm sorry. I went for the coffee because I was like, don't start.
All right, welcome back, everyone. I think we got everybody. Yeah. So let's look at the first case. I'm not sure who was in what group, but anybody can chime in. In the conversations that you had, what level would you address this conflict? Content, pattern, or relationship?
We said pattern.
Okay. Okay, why pattern?
We also said pattern.
We said pattern just because this is not like the first time that she has had issue with bringing in the contributions. This is the second year, and has been a consistent problem with her inconsistency.
Okay, cool. Did anyone say anything different than pattern?
Well, we were kind of stuck between pattern and relationship, because it did start affecting relationships of others, but not the person who had to speak to her. So she clearly had a pattern, but it doesn't look like anybody spoke to her about it. So she might not know that that's an actual issue. So we kind of like stuck in between like pattern, relationship, because it was affecting other relationships.
Okay. Corey, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Like, I think we all agreed that pattern was the highest priority of the issue, but it definitely affected the relationship because people wanted to leave the board. But at the same time, it was a pattern because she didn't initially finish her job in the first place. So it's almost all three, but we saw pattern as the number one issue.
Yeah, definitely. And because it is tempting to try to, dip into each side. But when you have to address a conflict, you have to choose which one it is, because that discussion sounds very different. Content sounds different than pattern, sounds different than relationship. How about the second one? What did you guys decide? This one was interesting. How many said, what did your group say? Content, pattern, or relationship?
I said relationship.
Okay. How many of you guys said relationship? Okay. Any group said pattern. Okay, so why relationship? What stood out to you in this case that you said that's a relationship challenge?
Maybe the yelling and screaming.
The avoiding interactions.
The sort of like put down comment of, I'm not a secretary, that's why I hired you. Just seemed a little sassy.
Yeah.
And the fear of the reaction. There's a fear-based about the interaction that could occur. That means there's not a good relationship.
Yeah, and I would agree with you guys with that one. Definitely, it's clear that it would be a relationship thing. But before it got to the relationship level, were there some? Do you imagine that there were pattern issues before it got? Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, and typically that's what happens with conflict is that it escalates, right? And if there's unresolved conflict, then the natural thing that happens is it impacts the relationship. And that's the thing that when it gets to that level, we have to work really hard to repair it, right? We have to repair that. So great conversation on that. So that's two things you want to be able to do is figure out what I want to talk about. That's the get unstuck part. And what level am I going to talk about it? Did it happen once? Is it a pattern, or is it impacting our relationship? So that's how you start to think about this conflict to avoid you having to have the conversation over and over and over again. So yeah, go ahead.
When we were discussing them, they both were pattern and relationships, and trying to see, even the example you would give about person being late to work, it was a pattern, but then you said going down further, relationship is the main thing. So is there an example of something that, because it feels like almost everything would come back down to relationship, to how it's not, I couldn't think, do you have an example of something that is not the relationship, that is just
purely
content of the pattern?
Yeah. So let's take a look at the second example. If it didn't have any references to frustration and shutting down and yelling and those kinds of things, then you're looking at it being a pattern. So if it was just you enjoy your irritated when he wants to do all his written work, handle it all his calls. So let's say that the issue is I'm constantly getting work from this person, and they're not doing their work, and that consistently happens. That would just be pattern. That you're constantly being assigned their work, or they're constantly asking you to do their work, and there's nothing else. There's no emotional kind of connection to it. It's just you're always giving me your work. That's pattern. What makes it relationship is now I don't feel comfortable talking to you. I'm thinking that we're not going to work well together. That's when you delve into the relationship part. So think of it as how I see you and how I think you see me is being compromised, then you're at a relationship level. So even with the example of coming to work late, someone's come to work late every day for the past 2 weeks. That's purely pattern. But when people start to come and complain to you, and you start to feel a way about this person coming to work late, now you're starting to look at them sideways, and you're like, I don't even want to deal with them anymore because they're not respecting the fact that I talked to them before. Now you're in the relationship realm.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yes.
A little bit? Okay. Yeah, it's when there's no other kind of emotional fuel that's in it, then it's probably pattern. But when you start to, things like, I don't feel comfortable, I don't feel safe, then we're at relationship. Great question.
We talked about in our group too, maybe even the sense of needing remediation when there was such an abuse of power between the dynamics of the, supervisor and the subordinate, and, the almost name calling or violence and yelling, that there might need to even be a mediator in that conversation, because the employee may not be comfortable with approaching the supervisor without some form of mediation.
Yeah, and does it get to that point sometimes where the conflict has become so volatile that it's difficult for those two people to resolve it amongst themselves? Yeah, that's a possibility, that they may not be able to resolve it amongst themselves, and someone else might need to be pulled in to address it. Yep, Lucy.
So the way that I'm understanding, or the way that I probably would like to see it, will be to identify the conflict or the issue when it's at a task level. So it's more like an easy thing. And addressing the issue when it happens, so it doesn't get to the rest of them. Okay.
Yep, you got it. As you see things happen, you want to start to address it so they don't get worse. Because the last thing you want to do is start to negatively impact the relationship because of unresolved conflict. It's easier to address it when it's at the content or pattern level, like task issues, like a task conflict. Let's nip that in the bud so it doesn't become a relationship downer. Let's nip it in the bud. Great questions.
Thank you.
Great questions. Any other thoughts or questions? Cool. All right, so that is that. So two things, we kind of just did a recap. Identify what it is, what conflict you want to deal with, and then figure out what level do I want to have that conversation. The other place I want to spend just a few minutes on is this whole idea of start with heart. So remember our model that you saw around crucial conversations or addressing conflict is, did I put a model in this one? Well, yeah, I think it's after this. So here it talks about working on ourselves first. So we're still in that space of making sure that our head and our hearts are in the right place in order for us to address the issue. I have a video in here. I'm going to try to play it to see if it will play for us. If for some reason it's lagging too bad, just yell at me, because I know that's annoying when you're watching something that's not, and it's buffering and all that good stuff. So we're going to talk about staying focused on the real issue. So here you're going to see Trenton and Melanie have a conversation, and Melanie is going to try to give Trenton some advice on how to utilize dialogue issues. So if your microphones are down or your speakers are down, turn them up if you're able.
Okay, bye-bye. Yeah, bye.
Trenton, what were you thinking? The next time you're in a crucial conversation with me, you can't be so rude. Look, when emotions start kicking in, you gotta be like me. A dialogue master. Oh, just a second. Yeah? No. No, and no. Did you hear me, Chicken Lips? I said no. What idiot hired these idiots? Okay, yeah, I know, but he didn't deserve dialogue, trust me. Now, where was I? Dialogue. True dialogue, that is, calls for a change of heart. For example, someone disagrees with one of your really great ideas. Now, you think to yourself, they may look like a loser, they may sound like a loser, but there is a chance that they may not be that big of a loser. Are you writing this down? You ought to be taking notes.
Oh my word. So the point is, while we are acutely aware of how others contribute to unhealthy conversations, we are often unaware of how we might be contributing to the problem. So we have to focus on our side of the street and keep our side of the street as clean as we possibly can. So I want to introduce this idea called left hand, right hand column. And there's this psychologist named Chris Argyris who came up with this idea. And the idea is there are things that you say, but it may not necessarily be what you really mean or think and feel. So your right-hand column are the things that you actually say to a person. Your left-hand column are the things that you're thinking and feeling that you don't verbally say. So I'll give you an example. So a coworker comes to you with a suggestion for a software program you two are developing. You think it's a bad idea, but don't think speaking up will do any good. So this is what our columns will look like. So on our right-hand column, this is what the conversation will look like. Me, do you really think that's a good idea? You say this to the coworker. The coworker is, yes, I've given it a lot of thought. Me, okay, if that's what you really want to do, that's your right-hand column. But what does the left-hand column really look like? The left-hand column looks like this. This is what this person's really thinking. That's the craziest idea I've ever heard, and it will never work. Or he won't listen to my feedback anyway, so what's the point of me saying anything? I'm just gonna let him fail and learn his lesson. So the right-hand column is us trying to be politically correct. And our left-hand column is what we feel in our gut and our bones. And so when you're having a conflict with someone, we do the exact same thing. We have some conflict happening within ourselves. We're like, oh my God, this is so what I want to say. But I know if I say it, it's not going to go well. So I want you to think about a conversation that you had, and it may be with the person that you put a star by, exclamation part by. I want you to populate your right-hand column. Recall a conversation that you had with that person that did not go well. And I want you to write down what you said and what they said. Just your right-hand column, don't touch the left-hand column. What did you actually say? Just a few lines like you see here. Take a couple minutes. Your right-hand column, what was the gist of the conversation? What did you say? What did they say? So I'm gonna give you 2 minutes to populate that right-hand side. Don't touch the left-hand side, right-hand side. What did you say? What did they say in the conversation that didn't go well?
So I know for right now we're just doing the right side, but I have a question about the left side.
Yeah.
So for the left side, is it just what you are thinking but don't say in the moment? Or like, I'm a kind of person who, when having a conversation, sometimes it takes me a while to process my thoughts and feelings. So my left hand might not appear in my head until 4 hours after the conversation, when I'm keep replaying it in my head and thinking of all the things that I wanted to say that I didn't verbalize.
Yeah, and it could be that, or it could be one of those situations where you're in the conversation and you're saying one thing, but you're not saying what you really want to say. And it also may be a situation like you, it takes you a minute to reflect. This is what I really wanted to say, or this is how I'm really feeling it. So that would be your left hand. What did they say? What did you say? Now I want you to transition to your left-hand column. What are the things you were really thinking and feeling in that conversation, in that dialogue? I'm sure they pissed you off and you were just not happy. What are some things you were thinking and feeling that you did not say? Now, this you do not have to share with anybody. And if the person is living in your house or in your office, just make sure you hide this so they don't see what you was really thinking and feeling. So in that left hand, that it doesn't make, I mean, it is not, we are not at our best when we're looking at a left-hand column. So in your left-hand column, what were you thinking and feeling? So I'll give you 2 minutes to jot down your thoughts there. So when you look at both your columns, what are some things that you were thinking and feeling that you didn't say, the kinds of things? You don't have to tell us what exactly it is, because that column isn't always the prettiest. But what are some things that you were types of things you were thinking that you didn't say?
I can share that I was actually like worried about the person, or afraid they weren't, maybe feeling like they could be honest with me. Maybe I didn't really believe what they were telling me, as far as my right hand was like checking in, and they're like, I'm good, and my left side's like, I don't really buy that, and I'm actually really worried or afraid like something else is going on.
Yeah.
That way.
Cool. Corey, what you got?
My left-hand side tends to be my dismissive thoughts of like, why are you making such a big deal about this? This is stupid. Don't think that way. And then really transitioning to be like, oh, I see what you're talking about. It's just, yeah, that dismissive part of me is my left-hand column for sure.
Yeah. So how do you reconcile that, Corey?
I don't know if this one's strangely for my scenario, which is a family one, but just kind of being a supportive role for both people in the middle of something, offering the same solution to both sides, not offering something to one person and not the other.
Okay. And I also hear
if
a
that
little
makes any
bit of,
sense without the context.
yeah, that makes sense. And then also hear, when you said that, I hear validation of both sides feeling like they're being heard. And I think that then helps with the side of you that might be a bit dismissive. Because if they recognize that, one, you're trying to create a space where there's validation, then they won't feel dismissed like you feel in your left-hand column. Cool. So the second question is, the stuff in your left-hand column, even though you did not articulate it, a lot of times it shows up. So I want you to think about, how did your left-hand column show up? Even though you didn't say it, it still showed up. How does that happen? And you can kind of think about that and then jot down as I'm kind of talking through it. Because sometimes when we think that the person is not being honest, we're thinking that they will never change, they'll always be that way. Or the other person is just incompetent. Like if that's all the stuff we're thinking and feeling, we don't say it. Our right-hand column, we all politically correct and stuff, and we're just all professional, but that left-hand column still shows up. How does the left-hand column show up in the conversation anyway, even though we try to play good poker faces?
I feel like for me personally, you leave that dialogue section and you go to that silence or violence. So like for me, I do silence, and you just don't, sort of your example of the right side, that's what you want to do? Oh, okay. So you don't really give any feedback. You just say, all right, you do you.
Yeah. And we don't say anything. We just let them go. And what we're thinking is, dude, that is not going to work. It's like, you tried that 5 other times and it didn't work, but okay, go forth and prosper. So that we have to be mindful that in a conflict, if we're not truthful and honest, our left-hand column is going to show up, whether we think it is or not. It shows up because people see it in our tone of voice. They see it in our body language. They see it in the choice of words. They see it all through here. And so what we want to be mindful of is, we want to make sure that our right-hand column and our left-hand column coincide with one another. They're connected, they're aligned. And the word I'm really looking for isn't coming to me. So we want to make sure that there's alignment between our left-hand and right-hand column. They're not in conflict with one another. A lot of times you may be thinking to yourself, but Tish, my left-hand column ain't pretty. But the fact of the matter is, your left-hand column is your truth, right? Your left-hand column is really where you're at. And so how about we think about making that left-hand column, the thing that we think is undiscussable, making it discussable. Is it possible that we can make our left-hand column discussable? Yes. You have to give it a voice, because if you try to suppress it and you try to kind of stuff it back, it's going to seep out in ways that you can't control it. And so what you rather do is be able to have control over what's oozing out of you. And the way that you control it is that you put it out there and you just say what it is. So for example, if you feel like someone is being dishonest with you in that conversation, you can say, you know, I hear what you're saying to me. I want to share with you a challenge that I'm having right now. And that is, and I could be wrong, but what I'm challenged with is, I don't feel like you're being 100% honest with me. That's not how I want to feel. That's just where I'm at. And I'm hoping we can talk about it. What do you mean I'm not being honest with you? Are you calling me a liar? No, that is not my intent. My intent is for us to be able to have a very open dialogue with each other about where we're both at. And where I'm at right now is I want to understand truly where you're coming from. And I don't necessarily think that what you're saying to me is the complete truth. And I just want to get to the complete truth, because I care about our dynamic. I care about our relationship. And I just want us to be at a place where we can put our cards on the table and talk about it candidly. So can you, if someone's lying to you, can you make that column of someone being a liar discussable? Yes. Thoughts? This is where the skepticism comes out and you're like, huh? Go ahead, Marianne.
I have a question, Tish. You know, I'm thinking about more of a personal conversation. And like, what about when someone likes to have the last word and then calls the conversation over? And so then they walk away and you're kind of like, well, this isn't complete, but there's not a whole lot you can do about it.
So that's a good one. That's a good one. So it's like you're ready to get into it and they're just like, I'm done, this is over, and they walk away.
It's like calculated answers and it's boom, 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 boom. Okay, we're done. And then you're like, so you don't have a rebuttal or even a dialogue because it's considered over.
Yeah.
Once
So
the statements are made.
I imagine that's yeah, exactly. Like that sounds like a pattern thing to me, that it may be a pattern thing, that's the interaction. So when someone comes to you and that's been your experience, that's been the pattern you've experienced from them, in the next conversation, you kind of get a sense of where it's going. Then you say to yourself, you ask them, you say, okay, I want to be clear about what our desired outcome is of this conversation. I've noticed that other times when we've had conversations that you're able to share your perspective and there's not room or time for me to share mine. And so before we have this conversation, can we be clear about what our intent is of this conversation? That way you're holding them accountable to say, okay, if this conversation is not for the two of us to have a discussion, then let's not have this discussion. If it's just for you to have diarrhea at the mouth on me and I don't have an opportunity to respond, let's just not have this conversation. And so when you set up that agreement at the beginning of that conversation, this person proceeds to stand up and walk out when they've said their piece, you can say, we made an agreement at the beginning of this conversation that this would be a dialogue. And what I'm experiencing from you right now is that it's a one-sided conversation, and that's not what we agreed to. Can we spend the next 15 minutes bringing this to a close?
Thank you.
Yeah, so set it up at the beginning because when they walk away, you know, sometimes you're so stunned, you don't even know what to do. You're like, what just happened? So you may go behind them later that day and say, hey, you had an opportunity to share your perspective with me. I didn't get an opportunity to share mine. I'm hoping we can do that. So that's one way to do it. Or when you have to have another kind of conversation with them, you set up expectations at the beginning and hold them accountable if they don't align with that expectation, if that behavior happens again. Great question. Other questions?
I guess I'm still in my head thinking about how you said, you know, I don't feel like you're being honest with me, and the person then can get sort of, I feel like when we accuse or share with someone that we don't feel like they're being honest with us, I feel like it goes into that defense of, you know, well, you think I'm lying. Is it a better or a different way to form it, sort of saying, I don't feel like you're being open with me? Because I feel like if someone tells me, you know, hey, I don't feel like you're being open with me, I feel like it's not as much of this automatic, well, you think I'm lying, like they're different, but they're the same but different, I guess.
Yeah, it's nuancing it, right? It's figuring out the language so that the wall of the other person does not go up. And so if the language is, I don't feel like, I feel like you're not being as open and, being as open with me, that may be language that works for that person. So it's also knowing the person that you're having the conversation with. If you know their hot words, don't use the hot words. Like if you know that the words that will shut them down, avoid those. And what we're going to talk about too is if someone misunderstands your intent. So if someone's like, you calling me a liar, there's a thing that technique that we use called contrasting statements. And what contrasting statement does is it clarifies your intent around why you're having the conversation. It's not my intent for you to feel like I'm calling you dishonest or that you're lying. That certainly was not my intent. And if that's how you took it, I apologize, that was not it. What I am trying to do is have a conversation with one another where we both can be open with one another so that we can get to the result that we want to get to. That's my whole intent. And so we'll get to how to use contrasting statement to help with that. But yeah, the word choice is key. Very key. All right, cool. So you guys want to keep plowing ahead or do you need 5? This time is flying by. I can't believe we're at 11:12. Fly by or need a break? Keep going. Okay, so if someone needs to take a quick break, that's cool, but we'll just keep plowing ahead if you guys are cool with that. So now we've talked about figuring out what the heck I want to talk about and what level I want to talk about it. And then we spend some time making sure that our right-hand column and our left-hand column are aligned. So making our left-hand column, which appears to be undiscussable, making it discussable. And really being true to how we're really thinking and feeling and being mindful of our word choice when we're talking about our left-hand column. The next concept I want to cover with you guys is this idea around mastering our stories. Without this, you can't see that. Okay, so with mastering our stories, this whole idea is how do I get out of my own way? How do I make sure I'm challenging the stories I'm telling myself about the conflict and about the person I'm in conflict with? So here is a clip. We're still on Work on Me First, Mastering Our Stories, of Rick, and he's not happy about something. So I'm going to share this with you, and if you were the recipient of this message, how would you feel?
You know what's wrong with you? You think you actually know enough to think on your own. I told you exactly what to do. Exactly. And then you go off without thinking and you get yourself into this mess. And now look at you. You come in here with those deer in the headlight eyes begging for forgiveness. Well, I'll tell you something, pal. You've come to the wrong place because I'm fresh out of sympathy this time.
Yeah. So there's more to that story. And I'll share with you a little bit later. But we wouldn't feel good being the recipient of that message. And so what we're going to talk about is this idea called path to action. And the model is actually in your participant guide under Mastering My Stories. So this is what happens. In a conflict, you see and you hear something. Based on what you see and you hear, you tell yourself a story about it. Based on the story you tell yourself, it generates a feeling and then an action. So here's an example. Your sweet daughter walks in the house after curfew smelling like alcohol. What story do you tell yourself? You decide that she's been out drinking with her little boyfriend. How does this make you feel? Furious. You feel angry, you feel disrespected. You can't believe that she broke the rules that were put in place, by the way, to keep her safe. So that's a feeling. And so your action is you yell at her, ground her, and send her to her room You promise her that you will finish the discussion in the morning. So we saw her come in, you know, late after curfew, smelling like alcohol. So you say, she's been drinking. That generates a feeling of anger. And then action is sending her to the room and grounding her. And then you give her a little bit more of the piece of your left-hand column in the morning. But here's the thing. Let's say that your sweet daughter comes in and she's late and she smells like alcohol. And as opposed to assuming that it's because she was out drinking, that we're curious. So instead of telling ourselves a story about what's happening, we are curious about what's happening. So on your participant guide, if you could just list over where it says tell the story, put be curious on that. So I'll give you just a hot second. Under tell a story, put be curious. So if we're curious, so let's rewind that. Daughter walks in, she smells like alcohol. She'd been hanging out with her boyfriend. And instead of assuming that she was out drinking, you ask her, baby, this isn't what I was expecting of you. Why are, first you're late, and why are you smelling like alcohol? And what she shares with you is, well, I told Ricky Ray to get me home before curfew because I know that, you know, it was important. So I asked him to bring me home before curfew, but instead he drove us to a party. And I tried to call, but the phone kept going to voicemail. And so I went inside because it was raining to keep calling. And while I was sitting there, because I wasn't doing everything that all the other kids were doing, someone took a can of beer and poured it all over me. So I ended up sitting outside for an hour until one of my friends got off work to bring me home. So in that moment, when she walked in the door after curfew smelled like alcohol, what she didn't need was for her parents to be down her back. What she needed was support. And if we automatically make assumptions about someone's behavior or performance, we miss huge opportunities to be able to show up in the way that they need us to show up. And so the whole idea around the path of action is to, certainly we see and we hear something. Challenge the story that you're going to tell yourself about it. Instead, be curious. Because now that I'm curious, what feeling that generates is I want to know what's happening with my baby girl. Something's happening here. I don't know what it is because this is out of character. And if that's how I'm feeling, then how I'm going to act is I'm going to grab her by the hand, sit her down and have a conversation. And even in that moment is when she can be vulnerable with me because it's a safe place. And she can then have the protection and the support that she needs while dad grabs the gun and go out and find Ricky Ray. So this important thing is, if you notice on this end of the model, remember this was the pool of shared meaning on this other side. So everything that we do here is deposited into the pool of shared meaning. And so we want to be careful of what we do with entertaining these stories because the output could be polluting the pool of shared meaning. Thoughts?
I have a question.
Yep.
What if the person that you're having conflict with fills in the story and responds that way and pollutes the pool constantly every time you try to have that conversation? How do you get them to be curious when they keep telling you the story and don't let you tell the story?
So we can't control whether or not this person wants to be curious with you. What we can do is ask the question to invite them to consider a different perspective. So here's what that might sound like. So someone is at you, they're like, this is what it is, this is gospel. It's almost like one of those value conflicts, right? It's like, I'm entrenched in this thought, this is what it is. So you would invite them to open their mind a bit and say something to the effect of, you know, I appreciate you sharing your perspective on that. Can I share with you an alternative thought or perspective that we can play around with? Or can I share with you a thought that maybe you haven't had a chance to think about. Can you help me understand why we're not able to explore other perspectives? Or can you help me understand how you arrived at the thoughts that you just arrived at? So it's asking the question to have them describe further for you where they're at. Because if we just respond to what they're saying or react to what they're saying, we're missing the opportunity to dig deeper into their perspective. So while someone may be coming at you and they're not interested in hearing a different perspective, our role is to seek to understand where they're coming from. Sometimes the more that people, the more opportunity you give them to have to explain what they're thinking, the less what they're thinking doesn't make sense when they say it out loud. So keep asking the question that allows them to peel back the onion so that they can see, okay, I might be a little bit off with that. And then when they share that, keep peeling back the onion, you may say, I appreciate you being open with me. The perspective that I have is different. Can I share it? Opposed to just sharing, because sometimes if you just share an idea, people are like, but if you say, can I share it? They're like, yeah, I guess. And then they're willing to listen. Does that help? We can't change, we can't change other people. The only side of the road we're mindful of or can control is our side of the road. And so what we do is everything that we can to make sure that the pool of shared meaning that we've created is pristine. And that we can't always react to what they're doing to the pool, but instead explore why they're doing to the pool what they're doing to the pool. Ask questions. Thoughts, perspectives. Yeah, buts.
I love your approach. It just softens everything. And even if someone come in and they have their mind made up, and then you dig deeper, ask those questions. Hey, can I suggest this? Can I ask you this? It kind of changes. It changes everything, you know. And and when you speak, I was thinking about Iyanla. Do anybody watch Iyanla Fix My Life? She always say, be open to the possibility that you could be wrong. So you could think you have all the pieces, but it may be something missing that you don't know about. So just be open.
That's
so
right.
So that leaves people more open-minded and willing to listen and receive information.
And I love that point, because even when you're in conflict and the other person may be thinking, so Yesenia brought up the idea where the other person is not willing to hear a different perspective, and that their story they're telling themselves, that's gospel for them. There may be a chance where they think the same about you. And so the way that you can start to disarm that is say, I recognize that I may not know all the answers, but I'm willing to have this conversation with you so that we can explore the best result for us both. And so when you can recognize that I may not have all the answers, that disarms that person just a little bit more, because we're coming to this conflict guns a-blazing. Somebody has to be willing to step back and be like, yeah, I may be wrong in this. So let's talk about it. Quickest way to change someone else's behavior is to first do what? Change our own. Change our own. All right, cool. So let me go back to here. So that's the path of action, just being really mindful of the stories we tell ourselves. So remember, this is Rick, and I showed the clip earlier around him acting a fool with the camera. So this is the rest of the story. So let's see what actually happened.
Heads up, you guys. Trenton's on his way over here, and he's got some bad news. It seems that the order that we've been working on for the past 2 weeks was shipped to Manhattan, New York, and not Manhattan, Kansas.
Oh, jeez.
It was a time-sensitive issue, so now the client's threatening to sue.
How in the world did that happen?
Beats me. We have to wait till he gets here to find out. Wait a minute. I know what happened. He did exactly what I told him not to do. He wanted to leave early to go to his kid's football game, so he asked to turn the job over to Martha, who was new. I told him no. And later, I thought I saw him walking to his car. That little weasel. He openly defied my authority. So how's the big job going?
That's what I wanted to talk to you about. It seems the package got shipped to New York and not Kansas.
You know what's wrong with you? You think you actually know enough to think on your own. I told you exactly what to do. Exactly. And then you go off without thinking and get yourself into this mess. And now look at you. You're coming here with those deer in the headlight eyes begging for forgiveness. Well, I'll tell you something, pal. You've come to the wrong place because I'm fresh out of sympathy this time.
Well, actually, I did follow your instructions exactly. But when I sent the routing slip up to your office for final approval, someone up there wrote down the wrong shipping code.
Oh. Well, that happens. So, good job. Good job. And I'll take it from here. Thanks for the update.
Take note of the timestamp. That whole thing only took 1 minute and 54 seconds for him to jack up a relationship. 1 minute, he followed his path of action. See how quickly we go through our path of action, and it happens so fast. He told himself a story. His story became his truth and his gospel, and did not leave himself open to hearing any other perspective. So what he ended up doing is looking really foolish. And so that's why we want to be mindful of the stories we're telling ourselves about the person we're in conflict with. And so what I want you to just think about is, what stories might I be telling myself about the person I'm in conflict with, that person that you put a star by, check mark, heart by? What stories are you telling yourself about that person or about the situation that could be wrong? How are we not giving, is there a possibility that we're not giving that person the benefit of the doubt? So think about that. What stories are you entertaining that could be inaccurate? And what does it look like for you to be curious versus telling a story? Huge. And again, this is us working on ourselves first, because in conflict, we got to really be mindful of what we got going on before we kind of engage with the other person, because if we don't, we bring in all our junk to the conversation. And we're depositing all that junk in the pool of shared meaning. So we got to clean up before we approach the situation. Thoughts, questions? Nope. Okay, cool. So that's the mastering my stories piece. The next section that I want to talk about is, well, how do you frame out the conversation? Like, how do you start it? So there's this idea called state my path, and it's in your participant guide, next section. State my path. Very simple, but we make it so hard. Less is more when you're approaching a conflict, when you actually have to say what you have to say. Less is more. Don't overdo it. So here's what it looks like. The first thing you do is share your facts of a situation. I'm going to use, who was that? Marianne. I'm going to use your example that you gave. The last 3 times that we've had a conversation, I've noticed that you were able to share your perspective and I wasn't able to share mine. That's the facts. Can you rewind back to the conversation, say we've had 3 conversations, and in those 3 conversations, you share your perspective, I was unable to share mine. So that's the first thing you do, is share your facts. What actually happened? I'll give you an example of what this is not. When you came into my office, you had an attitude. That's not a fact. Because what's going to happen is you're going to get into a tennis match. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. And it just goes back and forth. But when you state a fact, something that you can prove happened, press rewind. It's like a video. You can press rewind and say, this happened. That's what you lead with. You wouldn't say, you're not a team player. Yes, I am. No, I'm not. Yes, I am. You don't want to do that. So instead, you may say, you look at, well, what happened that tells me that this person is not a team player? When you were just in the staff meeting the other day, and your coworker asked you if you could help them with this project because you said that your calendar was free, you told them no. That's what you lead with, not you're not a team player. Does that make sense? So you start with the facts, what actually happened. The last 3 times we had a conversation, I noticed that you were able to share your perspective and I wasn't able to share mine. Next thing, tell your story. Now I'm about to blow your mind on this because I just spent the last 15 minutes telling you not to tell yourselves like ugly stories. And now I have on here, how are you saying tell your story? So here's what we mean here. Next to where it says tell your story, I want you to write this. What are the facts leading you to believe? I just put it in the chat. What are the facts leading you to believe? Did I spell believe? I before E, except before C. Yes. Okay. What are the facts leading you to believe? So the last 3 times we had our conversation, I noticed that you were able to share your perspective and I wasn't able to share mine. Okay, here's the tell story part. It leads me to believe that, or I begin to think that you really don't value my perspective. What are the facts that you need to be? The fact that I was unable to say what I wanted to say, it leads me to believe you really don't value my perspective or you really don't want to hear my perspective. The last thing you do, 3 things. The last thing you do is ask for the other path. How do you see it? Help me understand. Do you see it differently? These are all phrases. You only need a couple in your toolkit that you can use. Where we get into trouble is we put our answer, their answer, in our asking of the question. So I'll give you an example. The last 3 times we had a conversation, you were able to share your perspective. I wasn't able to share mine. It leads me to believe that you really aren't valuing my perspective or what I have to say doesn't matter to you. Can you help me understand why you don't care about what I think? That is a no. That is not ask the other person their path, because you just assume that they don't care. And that's not what we're doing. We're saying, I'm checking this out with you. This is what I'm thinking, but I want to hear it from you. And so if you arm yourself with, how do you see it? What's your perspective? Do you have a different, what's your thought on this? Those are the key phrases you want to use when you're asking others for their path. But if the answer is in the question, you're asking the wrong question. You should be able to take those statements. Notice that they're so blanket in general. You can use them in any situation, and that's what you want to do, is have questions you can use no matter what the situation. How do you see it? Help me understand. What are your thoughts? Those are the questions. Questions. So what's the first thing you
Tish,
do?
I love that. I really love that, because I know I recognize my role in it. Like I'll go and I'll be like, let me tell my side. So that already set us up as adversaries, right? Because we both have 2 sides. So I just peed in the pool, right? So I mean, I just screwed it all up. And so using the terminology you used and some of those questions about being curious and being able to, say, oh, that's your perspective. Do you want to hear my perspective? Is much better than, let me tell my side.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So the 3 things you do, what's the first thing you do?
State the facts.
Yep, state your facts. That's it. What are the facts? What actually happened? Not my emotions, because talking about your emotions out of the gate gonna get us in trouble. So what actually happened? Then what do we do?
Even the facts that leading you to believe that for your story.
Yes, thank you for saying it in that way. What are the facts leading me to believe? I'm starting to think that. I'm starting to wonder. Then what do we do?
Be curious.
Yeah, and we ask them their side of it. So when it says ask for others' paths, we're asking them, what's your side of it? So I want you to write down a couple of these statements, because you only need a couple. How do you see it?
Do you see it differently? Help
Do
me
you see it? Yes, yes. Do you see it differently? Help me understand. I could be wrong here. Can you clarify? If you put one, you got those in your tool belt, you just pull out one of them. That's it. You don't have to go beyond that. Ask the other person's path is the easiest, but the hardest because that's where we overdo it. So can you help me understand why you're so late all the time? Wrong question. Can you help me understand what's going on? That's the right question. Now, the other two is, I'm sorry, did someone say something? No. The other two, so talk tentatively and encourage testing and discussion. That's how you show up in the conversation. So the talk tentatively means we are not going to approach a situation and think that what we're saying is gospel. We're not approaching and saying that this is what it is. And we kind of talked about that a bit, like Yesenia brought it up earlier, when you come into the conversation and you walk into that conversation already knowing what it is and what it's going to be. That's not how we want to be. We want to be tentative, meaning we want to keep the door open to consider that there is a possibility that we could be wrong. We want to keep the door open so that we're like, this is what I'm thinking. I want to hear your side of this. That's talking tentatively. Encourage testing / discussion is you always want to be in a space where it is comfortable and safe for the other person to share their perspective. And you want to create a space where it's a dialogue and a discussion back and forth. So the top three, the share, start with your facts or share your facts, tell your story, what the facts lead you to believe, and ask the other person's path. Those three things are the what you do in a conflict when you're trying to resolve it. The last two are the how you do it. So you only do the top three things. The other two is just how your presence in the conversation. So it's very simple and succinct. What happened? What is it leading me to believe? And what is their thoughts? What are their thoughts? That's how you can start a conflict conversation. So I want you to try this on. There's some examples underneath that of kind of some phraseology that you can use, but on the next page, you identified a situation at the beginning on a conflict or a conversation that you need to have. So I want you to try on this idea of the state skills for that situation. So I want you to, your situations, you don't have to write it there, but what are the facts of the situation? What actually happened? And then under tell your story, what are the facts leading you to believe? What are you beginning to think because of the facts? And then how are you going to ask them their perspective? And that could just be one question. Cool? So I'm going to give you guys about 7 minutes to populate that box. What are the facts? What are the facts leading you to believe? And then how are you going to ask them to share their perspective? What questions can I answer? All right, cool. I'll give you 7 minutes. All right, a few more minutes. All right, one more minute. All right, let's come together. So I want you to test your facts. When you look at the share your facts column, I want you to make sure that they are things that actually happen, that you can press rewind and say that it actually happened. Make sure that your facts column is void of emotions, it's void of accusations, but it's just purely facts. Does your column, does it say that? Does your represent the facts? You could press rewind and it actually happened. Your next column, what are the facts leading you to believe? Does it truly encompass, here's where I'm coming from, or here's, based on what happened, this is what I'm thinking. So make sure your column answers that question, is does it illustrate what I'm really thinking? It's almost, well, not almost, it's the left-hand column stuff, but you're saying it in a way that's incredibly respectful and honoring, but and not a but, and it's respectful and honoring of you and your truth. The what are the facts leading you to believe is your opportunity to be open and honest. Does that column do that for you? And your last column, ask others past. It should only be one of those tools I gave you. How do you see it? What is your perspective? You know, I want, you know, what are your thoughts on this? That's it. How can I help you not cut me off when I'm talking? That's not it. How can I help you, you know, make sure that you're more honest with me later? That's not the question. How do you see it? Those kinds of questions. Any thoughts or things that came up for you as you were populating that box? Okay. So the last section is what happens if you do all that and the conversation goes off the rails? They completely misunderstand what you're saying and you're just like, oh my God, that is so not where I'm going with this. There are two things that you do. My little thing didn't show two fingers, but two things that you do. First, if someone misunderstands your intent, if it's appropriate, because sometimes we overuse apologies. If it's appropriate, apologize. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not my intent for you to think that I'm trying to pick on you. It is my intent for us to have this conversation so that we can figure out where do we go from here. So the first thing you do is if someone misunderstands your intent, apologize if appropriate. The second thing you do is clarify your intent using what we call contrasting statements. Contrasting statement. Contrasting statement, there's a don't part and there's a do part. The don't part is how might they be misunderstanding you. The do part is what you're explaining in terms of what you're trying to do. It's not my intent to upset you. It is my intent for us to talk about the situation that happened so that we can move forward in a good way. It's not my intent for you to feel like I'm cutting you off. It is my intent for us to transition this conversation in the way that we can move to action and results. Notice I'm not using a conjunction that starts with the letter B, and what is it? But, right. I'm not using the word but, because when we say but, it negates everything we just said we weren't trying to do. Sometimes it's hard to remove it from our vocabulary when we're talking about it, so I wouldn't focus on it. Just be mindful of it. So contrasting statement, it's not my intent to X, it is my intent to Y. So on your making it safe section, how might someone misunderstand your intent? The person that you need to address this conflict with, how might they misunderstand your intent? So I want you to just jot that down real quick. How might they misunderstand your intent? How might they not be giving you the benefit of the doubt? What assumptions might they be making about why you're saying what you're saying? I don't want us to argue. I just really want us to be at a better place, and I'm having this conversation so we can try to figure out how to get there. We've got great children. It's not my intent for us to be in argument all the time and we are sending the wrong unintended message to our children. What I'm trying to figure out is how we can be better co-parents together for the sake of our children. I'm not trying to say I want a divorce. That's not it. What I am trying to say is that we have some work we have to do, and I'm willing to do my part. I'm willing to own my stuff. And I want us to figure out how we can do that together. So in that next section where it says, what contrasting statement will you use to clarify your intent? I just threw out a whole lot of different options in terms of how you can, what contrasting statement you can use. How will you clarify for that person what your intent is by using a contrasting statement? So I want you to jot that down in that second box. What's your contrasting statement? I'm not saying you're not a hard worker. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is what I'm noticing recently is a departure from what I'm accustomed to. And so I want to figure out what's going on. Does somebody want to throw out their contrasting statement? Somebody may want to shamelessly steal it. What are some contrasting statements you guys came up with? Or are we keeping them secret?
Well, I stole some of yours, and I think for a lot of leadership at the YWCA, maybe universally, you know, we have time constraints. And one thing I've been trying to take to heart during COVID is to create more space for these conversations, because one of the things that I always have in my left-hand column is they don't know all the facts. They don't, even if it's personal, I'm like, they're not watching the news. Like, they don't know all the information that I've got going on over here. And I simply don't have the time to educate everybody. So like having that, where you one of the original coaching sessions where you get people out of those uncontrollable complaints, you know, like things that we cannot control, and gently moving them to that. It's my intention to transition this conversation to some resolution, you know, where we got to wrap some things up, some actionable items that we're going to commit to. I think is super helpful for me in the conversations that I know I have to have, because you want to hear people out, but you got 35 people out one day. So I'm always trying to like have that balance, right? So I think that's a great statement. We're not rushing you. It's not like I'm not trying to let you know everything, but we have to get to some resolution, right?
Yep.
Without making somebody feel like you don't want to hear them, because you do, but yeah.
Yeah. So your box above that was the way that they may misunderstand your intent is they may think that you're not trying to hear them. But
right, or I'm not making the time or whatever. And it's never what I want to convey, you know, it's just trying to move the dial, right, every day.
Yep. Perfect. That's a good one. Give me another one. Give me one more contrasting statement that you guys came up with. Nope. Okay, I won't push it. I was gonna call somebody, but I'm like, nah, I don't want to cause conflict. All right, so as long as you guys have that kind of laid out in terms of your state, sharing the facts, what the facts lead you to believe, and explore others' path, and being able to create safety. If someone misunderstands you, and you'll know when they misunderstand you, it's going to come out in their body language, their tone, or even what they say. Use your contrasting statement to get it back on track. And then you step back into the discussion. So that is our kind of our tools and our tips for managing conflict. So I want to pause and ask if there are any questions before I share the final slide with you guys. I can't believe that 3 hours just flew by as fast as it did. It went pretty quick. Yes.
One thing that I've really been trying to work on this year, which I think kind of bleeds into some of this too, is, you know, regardless of the statements or the situation, is not to take it personally, you know, like the 4 agreements, because sometimes I just take it so personally, and, you know, it's their truth. It's not about me, right? It's, you know, the belief. And so I try to, you know, thread that through conversations and what I do as well. It's not to make it a personal issue.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because in conflict, it could feel like it's personal in a conflict, like we take it personally. But in order for us to move forward, we have to not, because we could be making the wrong assumption, because we take it personal because we told ourselves a story. So we have to stop telling ourselves a story. And when we stop that, then we won't jump to taking it personal. That's a really good point, Marianne. Cool. So I will share with you guys what the field work is for this session. Okay, so you wrote down, you've already started part of this, which is identifying a crucial conversation or a conflict you need to address. So what I want you to do is actually approach the situation, have the conversation utilizing the state framework that you just populated. And then after you have the discussion, I want you to spend some time assessing what you felt went well with it and what you might choose to do differently. So that's the field work, and it's also listed on the bottom of your participant guide. And you can send that to me in 2 weeks in terms of just some self-reflection about what went well with it, what you might want to do differently. And even if you need to talk through it, or you did and you're like, oh my word, that didn't go well, let me know, email me, we could talk through it. Or you did and you're like, oh my God, that went brilliantly. I like to hear those too. Your next session is building trust and credibility with Holly, and that will be on July 8th. So we are 1 minute before closing time. And what questions can I answer before you guys enjoy the rest of your day making EPIC happen? No questions? All right, well, we will see you back on July 8th. And in the meantime, we will be sending you information about kind of your capstone and coaching opportunities. So I'll hang out in case anyone have any questions. Other than that, go forth and prosper.
I do have one question.
Yes, absolutely.
Can we do off the record though and not record it if that's okay?
Oh, absolutely. Yep.